Well, we're going to continue with the book of Esther, and whenever that we left off last time, there was a edict that had been passed by the king. And God has a way of getting into our sleep, getting into our thoughts, directing what we're thinking about. I'm sure all of you can name times whenever that maybe you were driving along, maybe not thinking about the Lord or about church, and then all of a sudden God just reveals something, or God just moves on your heart. And we shouldn't be surprised whenever that we read this in the 6th chapter of the book of Esther, that God would move upon the heart of a foreign king. And these, as far as we know, had no knowledge of the God of Israel, but yet God inhabited his thoughts and moved upon his thoughts, and even as we read this tonight, caused him a little bit of insomnia. Now, Walgreens was closed and Walmart was too, so he couldn't send one of his chamberlain down to get a prescription for a sleeping aid. But we'll see tonight what happened in that instance. On that night, and starting with the first verse in the 6th chapter of the book of Esther, on that night could not the king sleep, and he commanded to bring the book of records of the Chronicles, and they were read before the king. And it was found written that Mordecai had told of Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's chamberlains, the keepers of the door, who had sought to lay hand upon King Ahasuerus. Well, the king couldn't sleep. And so, to really kind of settle his nerves and kind of get him back to sleep, he got out something probably boring that would put him back to sleep. I had a teacher one time that he was doing a study about Parliament's debates back in, 1950. And he said, it's been a long time coming. He said, because when I read these accounts, these chronicles in the British Parliament, he said, I just nod off to sleep. He said, nothing against Parliament, nothing against the British government, but he said they have some of the most boring debates that a person could ever imagine. Well, these chronicles, I would think were in the same way. They were kind of to help the king kind of listen to them, and maybe the sound of the voice of the chamberlain would kind of make him drowsy. But he found an interesting thing in reading the Chronicles. He found out that there had been a conspiracy against him in verse 2 by two of the chamberlains, Bigthana and then also Teresh, two of the chamberlains. Now the kings were always, in this day and time, kind of looking back over their shoulder. You know, there was kings that were always fearful that they were going to be assassinated, that somebody was going to take their throne, and as much as there was in that day and time, there probably always was somebody peeking around the corner trying to find an opportunity to take the king's life and maybe overthrow the government. And some kings, if you read about the kings in Israel and the kings in Judah, some of them didn't last but maybe a few months. You know, and they were assassinated by somebody. And then that king would take over, and he'd last maybe about 3 months. And so there was a constant turnover with, especially the kings of Israel. There was a constant turnover of kings. And, you know, made for a difficult situation, knowing who was in control and who was in power. But nevertheless, that was always something that a monarch feared. And so was the same thing with King Ahasuerus. And he found out that these two individuals were about to lay hands upon him to take his life. But then he found another interesting thing of who was responsible for saving his life. And so he found out that it was Mordecai, the judge that was always found in the gate. And so the king indicated in verse 3, "What honor and dignity hath been done to this Mordecai?" He said, "I read that Mordecai saved my life, but I don't read anywhere where that anything was done, where that he was recognized." And we do find it in the Chronicles, but somehow we forgot to reward him. Well, about the same time, Haman comes on the scene, and Haman is looking to hang Mordecai at this time. And so you can kind of see where it's all building up to, and it sounds like a pretty good documentary, or a documentary for Netflix. But God is orchestrating all of this, and He's bringing this all to a head at one point. And so Haman comes in to get the order from Ahasuerus to kill Mordecai. You remember how that he's built this gallows up about 75, roughly about 75 feet, 50 cubits. And this thing was out kind of on display. And then also he was working towards not only killing Mordecai, but killing the people that Mordecai was associated with, the Jews that were in the kingdom of Shushan. But not only there, but some of the remnant that had gone back to Jerusalem and had stayed there after they'd built the temple. If we could do a time lapse, they were able to go back under, I believe, Cyrus. Might have been Cyrus was king of Persia at that time. They gained favor. The Jews that were in Persia gained favor with him. They went back. They got the opportunity to rebuild the temple, but then it just kind of stopped short. They weren't able to go ahead and work on the rest of the city and the wall around it. So the Jews that would have been killed would have been not only those in Shushan, but also throughout the kingdom, in about 127 provinces. And I'm kind of doing a review now to show where that this is going to climax in chapter 6. Whenever that the edict went out that all the Jews were to be killed, it went out to 127 provinces. And most of these provinces spake different types of languages. You know, I'm not sure what the languages were, but no doubt the scribes in writing out the edict were very busy. They had to write it in the language of, I don't know, the Syrians, or, you know, whatever there might be. So there was about 127 edicts about on a certain day of killing the Jews that were in the kingdom of Persia. And that kind of coincides with Haman coming in about that time, that unknowingly to him that the king was going to grant and give recognition unto Mordecai. We find that the king says in verse 3, "And the king said, What honor and dignity hath been done to Mordecai for stopping this assassination attempt? And then said the king's servants that ministered unto him, Well, there was nothing done for him. He received no honor. He received no recognition. But we do have the proof here that Mordecai did save the king's life. If it had not been for him, the king would have been assassinated. And the king, about the time that Haman came in, recognized that it was Haman. Now, Haman had gained quite a bit of favor with the king. And Haman's motive and his goal was not only that he was going to receive recognition for all that he'd done, but I suspect that he had a knife behind his back ready to do the king in. And so we find that he comes in to speak to the king about Mordecai. In the 4th verse, the king said, "Who is in the court?" Now Haman was come into the outer court of the king's house to speak unto the king to hang Mordecai on the gallows that he had prepared for him. The king had no idea what those gallows were for. Haman had kept it hidden from him. And now Haman thought that at this point he was going to spring the trap and that he would kill Mordecai. That would be his first victim. Next would be the Jews and all of the kingdom. And I want you to think with me for just a moment. This is one of those what-if moments. What if Haman was able to have gotten away with what he was doing? What if he was able to get the edict passed and all the Jews, now this means all the Jews, would have been slain? What would have happened then? Anyone want to venture a guess? Well, for the most part, it would have ended right there, wouldn't it? Yeah, it would have ended there, and of course, God has a way of still getting His will done. But some people have speculated what might have happened was that the tribes would have been annihilated, and then the tribe, most importantly of all, the tribe of Judah. Who came from the tribe of Judah? That's exactly right. That's exactly right. So you can see that through Haman, and you might as well call him the devil, because that's what he was. Through Haman, the devil was working to stop Christ from coming into the world. You know, and you'll see things like this. And when you really get to looking at it, you know, here was Satan trying to stop. Why would he want to stop Jesus from coming into the world?
He knew what he was going to do. He would defeat Satan.
That's right. That's right. It would go all the way back, wouldn't it, to Genesis chapter 3 and verse 15, where that God told the serpent, in essence, told Satan, that the seed of the woman, and think with me for just a moment, I'm kind of rabbit trailing here. Think for just a moment, whenever that the patriarchs referred to offspring or who was to come, they always said of the seed of man. But here God said of the seed of woman. So it's a hint that it was going to be one who was going to be of the seed of woman, who was going to crush the head of the serpent. And in crushing the head of the serpent, it would bruise his heel. And so you see a picture, you can see a picture in this of Christ coming into the world, virgin born, not of the seed of man, but of the seed of woman, and going to the cross. And that's what Satan was trying to prevent. He was trying to prevent Jesus from dying upon the cross and purchasing our redemption and dying for our sins. If that had not happened, we would have a veil up here, and we would have a Holy of Holies back here, and we'd have a group of sheep out here or there or wherever, and we'd be slaughtering them just right and left. And the atonement for our sins would come like once a year. But when Christ died, that was it. He died once and for all time, for all sin. So we find, and I know that's kind of taking us off of here, but I thought I'd just mention that's one of those what-if moments. If the Jews had died. Now possibly it wouldn't have been. But God would have intervened in some other way. But, just think, if Christ had not come, we'd all still be in our sins. So, Haman comes in to get the order from the king to execute Mordecai. And before that he could state his business, and here's God once again, before Haman could say to the king, you know, I've got the gallows prepared, Mordecai is a conspirator, he needs to be hung, we need to get rid of the Jews. Before that he could get that out of his mouth, the king said, what should be done for the man whom the king delighteth to honor? What should be done? He kind of posed a rhetorical question there. And Haman, being the narcissist and selfish individual that he was, thought he was talking about him. Now, can you see what this is going to kind of lead up to? Oh, not only am I going to get rid of Mordecai, I'll just be that much closer to the throne. And I'll be able to get the ultimate goal. I'll get rid of Mordecai, get rid of the Jews. I'll be the next king. I'll get rid of him. I'll get rid of Esther. We'll just throw her in while we're at it. But we find that I think that Haman just kind of went a little bit too far, thinking he was the one in the 7th and 8th chapter, 7th and 8th verses, that he was the one that was going to be receiving this reward and this notoriety. Haman answered the king, for the man whom the king delighteth to honor, Haman said, let the royal apparel be brought which the king useth to wear, and the horse that the king rideth upon, and the crown royal which is set upon his head, and let this apparel and horse and everything be delivered to the hand of one of the king's most notable princes, that they may array the man withal whom the king delighteth to honor, and bring him through the streets on horseback. And he said, and proclaim before him, thus shall be done to the man whom the king delighteth to honor. And I would imagine Haman just saw himself sitting on that horse. And he probably went and got a tape to make sure that the royal apparel would fit him, and the crown upon his head, that it was going to be fitting just right. Then in the 10th verse, then the king said to Haman, make haste and take the apparel, the horse, as thou hast said, and do even so to Mordecai the Jew. I could almost hear Haman's jaw drop on the ground. I think there for a while he probably couldn't catch his breath. He couldn't fathom it, but here he heard it from the king, and the king's word was the king's word. This was going to be done. Well, Haman couldn't divulge, his anger, being upset, asking the king, are you sure that you want to do this for this Jew? Haman took the apparel. Can you hear him grumbling? Mordecai, and I don't even like Jews. And here I'm having to put apparel on him. I could just hear him mad, and he said, I had this measured out for me, and here he's going to wear it, and what's he going to do with it? And if he's made a ruler or made second to the king, I bet he couldn't do it any better than I could. Anyway, not only did he have to put the apparel upon him, but it says he had to lead him. I guess what this means, when they brought him on horseback, he had to lead him through the streets. You talk about somebody whose face probably reflected what was in his heart.
Don't you know God had a point?
Exactly. Exactly. That's a good thought. God had to have had a part in this. And God is always on time whenever that He does things. We might think that He's not, but God has heard our prayers. And God doesn't always do it on our time slot. One of the most interesting things to read about over in Daniel, the 9th and 10th I believe the 11th chapters, Daniel was praying a prayer and praying and kind of repenting for what Israel had done to get them into the position that they were in Babylon, as captive to Babylon. And finally, the angel of God, I can't remember his name, I think it was Michael, shows up and he says to Daniel, he said, I would have been here sooner, but he said, I was over here fighting the king of Persia. And I believe God's fighting battles. We may not realize it, but God is fighting battles against the evil in this world. And someone will say, well, it looks like there's a lot of it going on. But can you imagine how much worse it would be if God wasn't fighting against it? And He is putting angels in charge over us. I believe that with all of my heart. Well, here comes Haman, mad, leading Mordecai along. And he had to proclaim before him. He had to say, this honor is due unto Mordecai. Man, to talk about making things worse for him. And, Haman had just about all he could take. And said it hasted to his house in mourning, having his head covered. And so he got to the house, and he was telling his friends, he was telling his wife about what had happened, and it was a little bit different than whenever in the 5th chapter and the 14th verse, the conversation that they had. In the 5th chapter and the 14th verse, Zeresh, his wife and friends, had advised him about building the gallows to hang Mordecai on. Now they're telling him, Zeresh's wife said unto him, if Mordecai be of the seed of the Jews, before whom thou hast begun to fall, thou shalt not prevail against him, but will surely fall before it. This goes back to the covenant that God made with Abraham in the 12th chapter of the book of Genesis. And I kind of referred to this once before, but when I was about 13, I think it was 1967, my mom got me up out of bed. The TV was on early, and she was just like this, just staring at the TV. And what was going on was Israel had been attacked on all sides by the Egyptians, by the Syrians, by those in Damascus. All of the nations were gathered against Israel. And I'm looking at this and I'm saying, Mom, it's over. You might as well turn it off. And she said, no, it's not over. And she quoted to me Genesis 12, verse 12, what God said to Abraham, I will bless them that bless thee, and I will curse them that curse thee. Isaiah 54, and I believe it's 17, she said, there shall no weapon formed be able to overtake you. And so, yeah, Mama, yeah, I know. But I'll tell you, when I came back to the TV the second time, they had defeated their armies over on the east. They had Egypt, the city of Cairo, surrounded. And Moshe Dayan, the general, was just waiting for the go sign to go in and occupy the city. But even better than that, they took the old city where that the wall is located at, part of Solomon's temple that still remains. And there is a picture, you've probably seen it, of the Israeli soldiers whenever that they first came into that city, into Jerusalem, and won it back. And they have their helmets off, they got their yarmulkes on, they're up praying on the wall. This was more important to them than any other victory. And I want to tell you something, irregardless of what we might think, God protects His people. God protects His Christian people too, the spiritual Israel. He protects you. So we find that Haman told his wife everything that had happened. And she said basically the same thing that we said tonight. Thou shalt not prevail against him, but surely thou shalt fall before it. And while they were yet talking unto him, and with him came the king's chamberlains, and hasted to bring Haman unto the banquet that Esther had prepared. Now this was the second banquet. There was a first banquet that Esther had prepared to ask the king an audience with him, to speak to him. He tipped his scepter towards her. She touched the top of it. And then she said, what I've come to ask you is that you and Haman come to this second banquet of wine. So the next chapter is going to be rather surprising, but yet it shouldn't be to us. Because, you know, whatever that a person sows, that he also reaps. Here's a prime example in Haman of that very thing. You know, there's a writer from years ago that made this comment, if I can remember how to quote it. He said, the thorns that come up to me come from the trees that I have planted. And this is exactly what has happened to Haman. So, starting in the 7th verse, so the king and Haman came to banquet with Esther. And the king said unto Esther on the second day at the banquet of wine, what is thy petition? And notice what he says here. He doesn't say just Esther. He says Queen Esther. He doesn't call her just Esther or hey you or you over there. He says Queen Esther. Because now she has got some authority, she's got some status, she's probably considered equal to the king. It shall be granted unto thee, and what is thy request? And once again he promises even the very half of his kingdom. And Esther the queen answered and said, if, O king, I have found favor in thy sight, and if it please the king, notice what she says, let my life be given me at my petition, and my people at my request. She starts to identify who she is and who her people are. For we are sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be slain, and to perish. And then she goes on to say, if we had been sold for bondmen and bondwomen, I would have held my tongue. That would have been fine. But although the enemy could not countervail the king's damage, she just more or less kind of brings it before the king and just kind of spills her heart before him that my people are going to be killed by an order, by an edict that was given by you. And she said, I am one of those people. I identify with the Jews. I am a Jew. This was kind of contrary to what Mordecai had told her kind of in the beginning. Don't tell the king that you're a Jew. But I think, you know, here was the time to reveal it. This is God working. Someone will probably say, well, I don't see where God said or anything like that, but God was working. And God was talking to his people. I want you to know he's doing it all the time. He's doing it all the time. So the king answered and said unto Esther the queen, who is he, and where is he that durst presume in his heart to do this? Who is this individual that wants to kill your people, Mordecai, you? And I think, honestly, I think innocently, the king had no idea what he had passed. You know, the king's word becomes the word. And sometimes there's probably been some other instances of where that the king's been tricked into passing a law or something that, you know, maybe he didn't didn't really intend to do. That happened with Daniel, and he was thrown into a lion's den. You know, the king at that time didn't realize what he had done. And you know, you can almost feel for that king whenever that you hear him say to Daniel, "Surely, Daniel, your God will deliver you." He came back the next morning and said, "Daniel, are you still there?" Daniel said, God sent his angels to shut the lions' mouths. God works. God works. Esther said the adversary. Now that word adversary is always used in instances of whenever that we're talking about Satan and his works. Over in the book of James, it says, be diligent, be vigilant, for your adversary, the devil, goes about as a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour. Haman was just as much an agent of Satan as any that we read about in the Scriptures. And there are people that are given over to evil in such a way that they are the agents of Satan. I was in a class that one of our requirements was to read about the history or about the life of Adolf Hitler. And it was amazing how that he rolled and rolled and rolled and rolled towards such an evil attitude, and all the blame was put upon the Jews. And he came up with an idea. You know, the final solution to all of this is if we annihilate all the Jews, then Germany will be great and she'll receive her former power. And people were so afraid of him, so scared of him, that, you know, okay. You know, there were some that stood up against him. My wife's aunt was born in Germany and lived in Berlin during that time. And I asked her, I said, "Aunt Ruth, you were there. Her father owned a jewelry store, and that was taken away. She lost her brothers, and she was the only surviving member out of her family, married the uncle, Shirley's uncle." And she said, "Paul, I've never told this to anybody, but," she said, "I went and attended one of the rallies in Berlin." And she said, he promised so much to us. He said, "You'll be restored. Your economy will grow greater." He said, "I will bring it about. I'll bring about Germany's former glories." And she said, "I even shook hands with him." She said, "I had no idea I was shaking hands with the devil." And there are people that I believe with all my heart that are given over unto that. I can't judge the man's soul. I don't know what kind of condition that he was in when he left the walks of this life and died in prison. But I've seen interviews with Charlie Manson, and I tell you, the look out of his eyes was something that just let me know he was just the embodiment of evil. And I believe there are people that give themselves over like that. Haman is a prime example of that. The adversary and the enemy in the 6th verse is this wicked Haman. And so Haman was afraid. Now the jig was up. You know, he's been discovered. His plot has unraveled. They know now what he's going to do. He was afraid before the king and the queen. Now in the 7th verse, it says that the king rose up in anger and went out into the garden. I believe he was really angry. I believe that he had a lot of wrath. I think probably more so that he felt like he'd been tricked and that he had the wool pulled over his eyes. In all honesty, I may be wrong, but I believe with all my heart he had no idea what he'd done, but that it was by trickery. And he probably had to go out and just cool off before that he made any kind of decision, before he made any kind of judgment, before he passed anything else. You know, he had to get his wits back about him. Well, in the meantime, Haman stood up before Esther to make a request for his life. He didn't dare go out into the garden, but he went to Esther, seeing that she had such an influence upon the king. And the scripture says that he made a request for his life to Esther the queen, for he saw that there was evil determined against him by the king. In other words, that, his life is probably going to be very short because he has conspired to make the king look bad and look like that he was a murderer. And if it had been accomplished, it would have fallen on the king's shoulders being responsible for it because it was his edict. And I think the king realized that, and I believe he was angry over it. So, at any rate, the king returned out of the palace garden, verse 8, into the place of the banquet of wine, and Haman had fallen upon the bed whereon Esther was. Now, in that day and time, and in Christ's day and time, whenever that they ate, they would recline upon. Have you ever been in an antique store and you've seen what they call a fainting couch? Okay. It's kind of like a long half sofa, what I would call it. Shirley wanted to buy one time, but said, well, we're not fainting, but, we sure can't sit on it, for very long. But that's what this was. It was a long, kind of like fainting couch. And whenever that they sat and feasted, they would sit kind of up close. The table would be right here. The food would be here. The wine would be here. And then there was always kind of spaces in between. There's a lot of scholars that believe that this was the arrangement in the Last Supper, whenever the Christ ate the Passover supper and instituted the Lord's Supper. And that's why they say that, because the conversation going on with him and John would have been on this side, Christ would have been here, and Judas would have been over here whenever that they ate the supper. So John could pretty well see what was going on. And whenever that Christ told him, said, it will be he that dips his hand in the sop at the same time that I do. Judas did that, and John saw it and recorded, so that he knew that Judas was the betrayer that would betray Christ. Well, this was kind of an arrangement, setting arrangement, eating arrangement for this banquet. And they say that whenever that somebody pleads mercy to a king or to a queen, that they don't stand up facing them. They don't get down on their knees facing them. Usually they kind of grovel. I shouldn't say grovel, but they lay flat on the floor and they hold on to their feet and they just plead and they just plead and they just plead, hoping that they might receive some sort of clemency. Well, unfortunately, Haman didn't know where he was at and fell on the bed. He couldn't find Esther's feet. And I think accidentally he fell on the bed. Well, you can imagine what the king thought whenever that he came back in. And he said, wilt thou force the queen before my eyes? And he said in the latter part of the 8th verse of that same chapter, as the word went out of the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face. They took him away. When they covered the face like that, that was it. And he told him, go and hang him on the gallows that he had prepared. Hang him thereon. And so, no question about it, the king said to do it. Even though Haman's been an advisor, the king said to do it. They hanged Haman on the gallows, and he had prepared for Mordecai, and then was the king's wrath appeased or pacified. We said a little bit early, isn't it interesting how that when people conspire to do something like that, it usually comes back on them. I use Hitler as an example. They're not even sure if they've got his remains or not, but it is thought that he probably, at the very last, committed suicide. And so Haman didn't exactly commit suicide, but it was just as good as being such. And so we're going to look at a portion of the 8th chapter. Now, we won't go all the way through it tonight. We will take it up later and kind of review some things. But at this point, the edict had gone out. And in that day and in that time, you don't add amendments under the king's word, the king's laws. You know, if people don't like what the king did, you know, they couldn't petition a congressman or whatever and see if they can debate it on the House floor, the Senate floor, and get a bill passed to amend it. Once the king's word went out, that was it. They were going to carry it out no matter what. And so we're going to find that on that day, Haman was out of the picture, but the edict to kill all the Jews was still standing. And so we're going to look at that probably the week after next, and we'll find out what happened in all of that. Were the Jews annihilated? Were they killed? Were some of them killed? How did they defend themselves? Now, if you'll read ahead, you'll find it where that it says that that they did defend themselves, but the way that they did it, they defended themselves against those that were coming after them and coming towards them to destroy them. Because you'll see that kind of connected with women and children, but if you read it carefully, it will kind of clarify all of that. It wasn't just the Jews just went out and just started slaughtering people. They kind of stood their ground, and whoever came after them, then they would fight them. So we'll look at that the week after next. Hopefully we can kind of see what happens. I'm going to go over just a kind of a review of a few things that we've studied tonight. You're not going to be tested on it. I always say that. I always kind of wanted to say that to a class. You know, I had a teacher, boy oh boy, in pharmacy school, and when he'd lecture, he would go up and down the aisle, and he would be lecturing. I mean, he knew this stuff cold. And he would stop in front of your desk, and he'd ask a question. And you better have some sort of answer. You would answer him, and he'd say, well, tell me more. Tell me more. Tell me more. So I'm not going to do that. But nevertheless, we want to go over some of the questions and kind of hit some highlights here. From the 6th chapter of Esther, what did the king have read to him? In the 6th chapter and 1st verse, what did the king have read to him because he couldn't sleep?
The records.
Yes. The records, the chronicles, everything that had been documented.
Oh, the kings do that. Do they keep records of what they did and what laws they passed or whatever? Is that?
I would say they probably did. Now, I don't know that for sure. But I would say they did, because you'll find phrases in the scriptures like according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, and so on and so forth. So they've been writing this. Scribes have been writing this down. Chronicles is an example of that. You'll see so many different names that you can't find anywhere else in the Bible, but they were very big on keeping records, keeping a paper trail, so to speak. So that's what the king did whenever that he couldn't sleep. He read the chronicles. Now, what did he find? whenever that he read or had the Chronicles read to him? What did he find?
His life had been saved and he hadn't done anything to help him.
Yeah, his life had been saved. He knew that much, but he wasn't aware of who saved his life? Mordecai. He wasn't aware that Mordecai was responsible for saving him from these two chamberlains. Okay. Whenever that Haman first came into the king, what was his first thought, whenever that he came in? And the king said something to the effect about, what should be done unto the man who has done this great honor? Haman. Beg pardon?
He thought he was talking about him.
Yeah, he did. You know, because he was going along thinking about his deeds and this and that and the other. And once again, it was part of a conspiracy, no doubt, down the road to take the throne from Xerxes or Ahasuerus. Was Haman happy whenever he heard who it was that they were going to honor? Yeah, I would say it didn't suit well with him. He was expecting it, and can you imagine? And we've talked about this before. Can you imagine Haman? I wish there was some way we could have had photography back then. Haman's face whenever that here he had to put the royal robe on Mordecai, whatever the crown was like, and top it all off, he had to lead the horse.
And to put ashes on ashes, he did that because he thought it was himself, so he wanted the best possible way for the people to see.
Exactly. Yeah, I hadn't really thought of that, but that was kind of like here he was going to have his own little parade, and winds up being a parade for Mordecai.
Stroked out.
He was leading the horse and not walking behind him.
Yeah, true.
I figured he was pouting.
Yeah, I think so too. Probably wasn't as happy leading the horse away as he was whenever he first walked into the palace to the king. Okay. What did Haman's wife Sherish tell him after that he led Mordecai through the city?
Mordecai was the seed of the Jew, and he fell before him, and he would fall before him.
Right. Links right up to Genesis 12:12, doesn't it? You know, God is not going to let anything like that happen to Mordecai. Okay. In Luke chapter 14, verse 11, it says, whosoever shall exalt himself shall be abased, and he that humbleth himself shall be exalted. Do you think that kind of fits this today with Haman? Yeah. He definitely fits this. Okay. The king went out into the garden after that he had learned that he'd been duped and was going to be the one responsible for killing all the Jews. And he went out into the garden. What did he go out in the garden for? Yeah. He was not happy. He was very angry. But I think probably in realizing what had happened to him, that he had to go kind of think, what am I going to do now? Not that he was in a dire strait, but he said, I've been duped once. I got to think this thing through and make sure that whatever my judgment is on this, that it's true. Okay. What happened to Haman after that the king came back in?
They covered him, took him out.
Right. Right. Yeah, it was all over. And kind of interesting, names of people and names of individuals and so on and so forth. We sat down and we did a name of people in the Bible that were despicable like that. We don't know if anybody's named their child Judas. We don't know of anybody who's named their child Lucifer. We don't know of anybody who's named their child Jezebel. And we don't know of anybody that's named their child Haman. And you might find a few Adolphs kind of here and there, but I think they're few and far between. But at any rate, I've enjoyed teaching this tonight. It's amazing what you get out of the Bible. And whenever that you go and you study it, what you keep right on finding in it, even more so than we brought out. We just kind of scratched the surface here on it. Yeah. There's one thing I want to add, and I'll close. Xerxes did die. And I'll be able to pronounce his son's name, Artaxerxes, I think it is, was his son. Esther was still alive at this time. Now, she had a place of prominence, but you're not going to read very much about that. But they think, and this is, of course, speculation, they think that Esther was very, very influential in the prophet Ezra and Nehemiah going back to Jerusalem to rebuild the wall. The temple had been built, the wall was next. So see how God works on that.